Welcome back to the Valley Today. Yesterday, the very first House bill of the 2025 legislative session was put forth on the Minnesota House floor after a delayed start due to the session due to a DFL boycott.
It was a bill that related to government data practices, specifically those of the Attorney General. Valley News Team's Quinn Gorham explains.
The very first bill for the Minnesota House in 2025 is a short one.
It changes two words in Minnesota Sunlight Law, which is called the Data Practices Act.
But also a controversial one.
I think that this bill actually does have a big consequence from two little words.
The new bill would have addressed a Minnesota Supreme Court case from 2022, one that allows the Minnesota Attorney General to withhold certain data that relates to corporations and other entities. Republicans say that the bill would have created transparency with issues like fraud.
There's been a lot of discussion recently about fraud in Minnesota state government. That's one of the areas where we don't know what investigations have happened in the Attorney General's office and have been closed.
But in a letter to bill authors, AG Keith Ellison said that the bill could have forced his office to disclose confidential corporate information. The DFL also stands firmly against the bill, aligning itself with the AG.
The Attorney General holds a lot of information in the investigations that are conducted through the Attorney General's office, whether it's nonprofits, companies, or individuals. Oftentimes, those cases are large and they contain a great deal of personal information.
The bill would have needed at least one DFL vote to pass, but failed to get the necessary votes on the House floor on Thursday. Republicans currently have committee control and the ability to get their bills to the floor. That's something they intend to continue to exercise.
It was important to us that we move this bill forward while we have the procedural ability to do that.
Reporting in St. Paul, I'm Quinn Gorham.
While the bill did receive a majority of House votes, it did fail to get the necessary 68 votes needed to pass, falling one short along party lines.